A lonely tune fades across the fog, leading Hamish Macbeth to the piper from his very first arrest, now found dead by the water's edge. Something in Loch Dhu is stirring, and it isn't just old music. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. The mist lay low over Loch Dhu that morning, thin as breath on a cold mirror. It shifted in soft curls along the loch's edge, catching on the posts of the old jetty and drifting across the narrow road that wound past Hamish Macbeth's police station. The world felt half asleep, the kind of Highland quiet that made even the gulls seem polite. Hamish stepped outside with Lugs trotting ahead, the dog's tail flicking with mild impatience. Lugs preferred the morning walk to breakfast, which Hamish always found faintly insulting, but he supposed dogs were entitled to their loyalties. The air was sharp with early cold, a bite that hinted at the winter creeping nearer. Hamish tugged his old jacket closer. It was frayed at the sleeve, but he was fond of it. New clothes felt like lies. Lugs stopped to sniff at a patch of damp grass, then sneezed as the midges stirred in a brief cloud. Hamish muttered something uncomplimentary about their persistence. Even in late autumn they clung on. He walked the familiar path along the loch, his long stride unhurried. He liked this route in the quiet hours, before Patel opened the shop shutters and before the Curry sisters began peering from behind their lace curtains in search of something to complain about. Here, with the faint slap of water against the stones and the distant creak of a fishing boat settling on its ropes, Hamish could almost think without interruption. Almost. It was Lugs who heard it first. The dog froze, one paw raised, ears thrust forward. Hamish paused, listening. For a moment there was only the soft murmur of the mist and the faint lap of the loch. Then, carried through the damp air, came a low drone, a wavering note from bagpipes. Not a cheerful reel or a quick march, but an old, steady tune, one Hamish had not heard since he was a young constable fresh from training. The sound drifted unevenly, as though the piper wasn't sure of the fingering, but the tune was unmistakable, and a small prickle ran along the back of Hamish's neck. Lugs let out a small whine. Hamish didn't blame him. "That'll upset the seagulls," Hamish murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. The tune belonged to Duncan McCrae, Duncan, who had played that very march on the day Hamish made his first official arrest, an anticlimactic affair involving a stubborn crofter, a missing sheep, and too much whiskey. Duncan had strutted along the main road, pipes blaring as though Hamish were being promoted to king. The villagers had laughed for weeks. Duncan had liked an audience. He liked the sound of his own pipes even more. Hamish stood listening as the tune wavered again, then steadied, then stumbled. Strangely tentative for a man who had once claimed no tune in existence could challenge him. Duncan had left Loch Dhu years ago under a cloud of scandal, a messy argument with the hotel staff, money gone missing, and a feud with the Curry sisters that had grown so fierce even the minister refused to mediate. Duncan had vanished after that, and Hamish had never expected to hear his name again, much less his music. Lugs nudged Hamish's knee, urging him on. The dog disliked bagpipes, but he disliked mystery more. They followed the sound toward the centre of the village. Loch Dhu was waking slowly, crofters heading for fields, fishers hauling damp crates, and Mrs. Wellington sweeping her front step with her usual vigour. She paused as Hamish passed. "Is that piping I hear?" she asked, eyes narrowed. Mrs. Wellington enjoyed being offended. It gave structure to her day. "Aye," Hamish said. "Someone's up early." "Someone's up daft," she sniffed. "At this hour, it'll sour the milk." Patel was unlocking the door to his shop. He glanced up, eyebrows raised. "Bagpipes this early, Hamish? Who's taken leave of their senses?" "Couldn't say." Hamish kept his tone mild. Patel shook his head. "Sounds like Duncan McCrae. Only he'd wake the dead for attention." A couple of tourists emerged from the bed and breakfast looking bewildered. One clutched a guidebook as though it might fend off the noise. A gull shrieked overhead, outraged. The piping grew stronger, then faltered, as though the piper had walked behind a building. Lugs tugged toward the harbour, so Hamish followed. The mist thickened as they approached the water. turning the boats into gentle smudges. The drone of the pipes shifted, then abruptly cut off altogether. The sudden silence was oddly heavier than the music had been. Hamish stopped at the edge of the harbour. Damp stones glistened underfoot. The air smelled of brine and old rope. "Where is he then?" he murmured. Luggs sniffed along the pier, nose twitching. Hamish watched the dog carefully. Luggs often sensed tension before he did. The dog paused, ears lowered. A soft whine rose in his throat. Hamish's unease returned. Something was off, a tune that shouldn't have played, and now silence thick enough to feel. He checked the old benches, the boats moored nearby, the steps down to the water. Nothing. No figure with pipes, no familiar old van Duncan had once driven. No movement at all except the slow curl of mist around the posts. Behind him, the village murmured back to life. Doors shutting, voices carrying, the usual gossip beginning its morning rounds. But the harbour stayed still, the kind of stillness that felt like held breath. Hamish stood there a few moments longer, letting the silence settle. Duncan was not the sort of man to slink away quietly. If he was here, playing that old march, someone else would have seen him. Someone else would have heard. He turned away at last, but not without one last glance over his shoulder. The loch looked innocent enough. Grey water, soft ripples, a drifting feather caught near the rocks. But something had returned to Loch Dubh this morning, and it wasn't just an old tune. As Hamish walked back through the village, Luggs stayed close to his leg. The dog's tail moved, but without its usual cheer. Hamish reached down to pat his head. "It's probably nothing," he said. Luggs didn't seem convinced. Neither was Hamish. The rain came softly at first, a thin, drifting veil that barely darkened the stones outside the police station. By mid-morning, it had settled into the kind of steady fall that soaked through wool and patience alike. Hamish Macbeth stood at the doorway, with one hand resting on Luggs's head, watching the mist curl across the loch. It thickened in patches, drifting low and clinging to the edges of the boats like an old shawl. The world felt muffled, wrapped in damp cotton. He had intended a quiet hour, with tea before tackling the work he dreaded, paperwork from Strathbane, but a call from a breathless tourist had changed that. A young man staying at the bed and breakfast swore he'd heard shouting near the jetty. "A row of some sort," he'd said, in that earnest voice tourists used when they had no idea how common raised voices could be on a Highland morning. Luggs shifted restlessly, sensing Hamish's unease. "Aye, I'm going," Hamish murmured. He locked the station door behind him, knowing full well it wouldn't stop anyone. The villagers saw locked doors as a personal challenge. Luggs trotted at his side as Hamish headed down the narrow lane that led toward the harbour. The further he walked, the thicker the mist became, swirling in slow tides that rolled off the water and across the planked walkway. The smell of peat smoke lingered faintly in the air. Someone must have lit their stove early. The gulls were quiet, which always made Hamish suspicious. Even the usual chatter from the crofts seemed softened, held back by the damp. Luggs stopped short, letting out a low, uneasy growl. The dog's hackles rose. Hamish followed his gaze toward the far end of the jetty, where the boards dipped slightly with age. Something dark lay slumped against the posts. For a moment Hamish thought it might be gear left behind by a fisher too tired to tidy up. But then a boot moved, or rather, the water moved it, lapping gently over the toe. Hamish's breath caught. He walked forward slowly, every sense sharpening. Luggs pressed close but didn't bark, as though even the dog understood the solemnity hanging over the scene. The body leaned awkwardly, head down, legs stretched in front, as though the man had simply sat to rest and forgotten to rise again. His jacket was soaked at the hem, where the tide had reached him, though not soaked enough for drowning. The rain made small ripples through his thinning hair, washing bits of grit from his cheek. Beside him, the battered bagpipes lay half in the water, reeds swollen, leather darkened. Hamish knew those pipes, not by design, but by the careless way they had been decorated with a faded tartan band Duncan McCrae always insisted suited him. Hamish knelt, the wet boards seeping cold through his trousers. Duncan's face, once full of swagger, had thinned with age. The lines were deeper, the mouth softened by weariness. There was no fear in his expression, simply a kind of tired resignation. Hamish felt a faint tug in his chest. Duncan had been foolish, but not wicked. Luggs nudged Duncan's sleeve with uncertain curiosity. Hamish placed a gentle hand on the dog's shoulders. "Leave it, lad." Behind him, footsteps squelched on wet ground. Mrs. Wellington had evidently wasted no time following him. She stood a good distance away, one hand on her chest, as though witnessing a tragedy performed strictly for her benefit. "Is he?" "Aye," Hamish said quietly. "He's gone." Within minutes, the small murmurs of Loch Dubh began gathering. A few fishers approached carefully, hats pulled low. A pair of tourists hovered by a lamp-post, as though fearing contamination by proximity. The Curry sisters arrived last, clutching their coats tight at the neck, eyes widening with a mix of shock and, beneath it, something like offended vindication. Jessie Curry sniffed. "Trust Duncan McCrae to return only to cause scandal." Nessie elbowed her. "Have some respect. The man's dead." "That's precisely why I said scandal. Dying here is just like him. Attention-seeking to the last." Hamish didn't answer. The sisters' bickering filled the silence in its own way. He inspected the scene with careful eyes. Duncan's jacket was damp but not drenched. Water pooled inside one boot, but the other was oddly dry, suggesting he hadn't staggered into the loch. A dark smear of mud marked one knee, the sort gathered on the moor path rather than the harbour. There was a faint scent of whisky, but the bottle in his pocket, the cheap kind Duncan always bought, was nearly full, not consistent with an accidental fall. The tide was low now, but Hamish noted the line along the posts. The body had been placed where the water wouldn't reach until hours later. Duncan hadn't washed up here. Someone had set him against the jetty, like a discarded memory. "Should we fetch the minister?" Mrs. Wellington asked, appearing at Hamish's elbow with startling stealth. "Not yet," Hamish said gently. "I need to phone Strathbane." A dissatisfied murmur drifted through the onlookers. No one in Loch Dubh liked the idea of Blair arriving. Gossip from the post office had long maintained that Blair killed houseplants simply by glaring at them. Still kneeling, Hamish leaned closer to examine Duncan's hands. Dirt under one nail, scrape along the knuckle, a bruise beginning to bloom under the jawline. Not a brutal blow, but a quick, frightened shove perhaps. Duncan had tried to defend himself, or catch his balance. Hamish rose, joints stiff with cold, lugs pressed against his leg. "Right," Hamish murmured. "Time to make the call." He returned briefly to the station and dialed the Strathbane number from the old landline. The connection crackled, distorting the voice of the duty officer who promised to notify Blair. Hamish deliberately gave only essential details, withholding descriptions he knew Blair would misinterpret, with his usual eagerness to blame the nearest drunk or troublemaker. Let the man drive up expecting a simple case. It would slow his damage. When Hamish returned to the jetty, the villagers had arranged themselves into distinct clusters. The Curries by the bench, the fishers by the stacked nets, the tourists at what they assumed was a respectful distance. Their whispers floated across the damp air. "Came back last night, so they say. Never could hold his drink. Had enemies. A man like that collects them. Think he was here to apologise to someone." Hamish filed these murmurs away. Gossip was seldom right, but it often led to the truth if one knew how to sift it. Duncan asking forgiveness matched what Hamish suspected, a man returning not to boast, but to make amends. Patel arrived, breathless from hurrying through the rain. "Hamish, is it? Oh dear." He pressed a hand to his forehead. "Duncan, after all these years." "Aye," Hamish replied. Patel crouched beside him, shaking his head. "He bought supplies last night. Just a couple of things. Looked nervous, I thought. I nearly asked if he needed help. Should have done." Hamish placed a slow hand on Patel's shoulder. "You're not responsible." Patel sighed. Still. Hamish examined the bagpipes one last time before the rain grew heavier. The reeds were swollen, but the drone pipe had a bit of grit lodged near the mouthpiece, as though it had been dragged across rough ground. That didn't match a fall at the harbour either. The pipes had been somewhere else first. He wrapped them lightly in a cloth to keep further rain from spoiling what clues they might hold. Above him, A gull finally called, the noise slicing through the weighted quiet. The villagers stirred like sheep at the sound. The rain thickened, a cold sheet now. Hamish felt it seeping through the back of his collar. Lugs shook vigorously, sending droplets in all directions. Hamish led the dog under the slight shelter of the fish shed roof. He watched the villagers drift away one by one, leaving only a few stubborn lingerers, who always found it difficult to let go of a good mystery. Duncan MacRae had returned to Loughdub, not as the brash piper of old, but a worn man with intentions perhaps nobler than anyone realised, and someone here, had not wanted those intentions acted upon. Hamish stood a moment longer, letting the rain wash the loch's surface into rippling patterns. He felt the old heaviness settle in his chest. Duncan had deserved a chance to explain himself, even if no one had cared to listen. Lugs pressed his warm side against Hamish's leg. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. "Come on, boy, we've work ahead." They walked back toward the station through the rain, leaving the jetty and its quiet witness behind. But Hamish couldn't shake the sense that the mist held its breath, waiting for what the tide would bring next. The rain slackened by early afternoon, though the mist refused to lift. It clung stubbornly to the roofs of Loughdub like a sulky cat, flattening the colours of the village until everything looked washed out and weary. Hamish Macbeth stood outside the police station, hands deep in his pockets, while Lugs sniffed at a puddle with the solemnity of a priest. The dog lifted his head suddenly, ears twitching. Hamish didn't need the warning. He felt it too, a disturbance in the atmosphere, a darkening of the already grey day. A police car from Strathbane came roaring into the village with unnecessary speed, scattering two hens and nearly forcing Mrs. Wellington to leap aside. The tyres screeched as the car pulled up, and out he came. Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his overcoat flapping like a disgruntled crow's wings, his red face twisted into its usual mask of contempt. "Oh, grand," Hamish murmured dryly. "Just what the day needed." Blair slammed the door with more force than required. "Where's that useless stick insect?" he bellowed to no one in particular. Hamish considered stepping inside and pretending to be out, but Blair had already spotted him. Anderson scrambled out of the passenger side, notebook clutched like a nervous offering. Blair marched forward, boots squelching through the mud. "Well, Macbeth, I hear you've got a dead drunk cluttering up my jurisdiction." Hamish kept his voice mild. "Aye, that's one way to put it." Blair snorted. "Don't start your sly Highland nonsense. Where's the body?" Hamish led them to the small shed, where Duncan MacRae now lay on a stretcher, respectfully covered. The mist outside softened the edges of the scene, but Blair's presence made the air sharp and unpleasant. Lugs stayed close to Hamish, nose wrinkling in distaste. Blair yanked back the covering with little ceremony. Typical, look at him, whiskey-soaked and clumsy, probably staggered off the jetty and knocked himself stupid. Hamish folded his arms. "Funny thing, sir, his jacket wasn't soaked through. And the tide pattern," Blair cut him off. "I didn't ask for your theories. You're always imagining mysteries where there aren't any." Anderson nodded vigorously. "Aye, sir, that he does." Hamish ignored Anderson. "There's also the matter of his shoes. They were clean, too clean for the harbour path, and mud on one knee that doesn't match the jetty." Blair flushed darker. "He could have knelt in mud anywhere. Are you daft?" Hamish simply shrugged, letting Blair believe he'd won the point. It was always best to let Blair underestimate him. It gave Hamish room to think. A crackling from Blair's pocket interrupted the tension. He fumbled out his landline pager, then marched to the doorway to call the station from the mounted phone in the car. Hamish listened to the one-sided conversation. "Of course I've got it under control," Blair barked. "A simple accident. I'll wrap it up before the papers sniff it out." He paused, tone shifting. "Aye, sir, media optics. Always media optics." His voice became syrupy, with insincere respect. "Yes, Superintendent Deviott, absolutely." When Blair returned, the arrogant swagger was back. "Right, Macbeth, you'll assist me by staying out of my way." Hamish nodded pleasantly. "Of course, sir, wouldn't dream of interfering." Anderson smiled, though he seemed unsure why. The village, having sensed Blair's arrival, like cattle sensing an oncoming storm, had retreated indoors or taken up strategic positions behind curtains. Only Patel braved the street, walking over with the air of a man offering a peace gesture to a hostile invader. "Tea, Inspector?" Patel said with forced cheer, holding out a flask. Blair glared at him, but snatched the cup anyway. "It's lukewarm," Patel smiled thinly. "A shame." Hamish hid a smirk and walked toward the hotel, Lugs trotting beside him. Blair followed reluctantly, Anderson stumbling behind like a badly tethered sheep. Inside the Loch Dubh Hotel, Malcolm Fraser stood behind the counter with an expression of doom. His tie was already crooked, and his hands fussed with a stack of receipts that didn't need straightening. Malcolm always grew flustered in the presence of authority. "Inspector Blair," he said with brittle politeness. "Welcome." Blair sniffed the air, as though checking for signs of decay. "You were the last to see this McRae fellow alive, I hear." Malcolm flinched. "He tried to book a room, but he got into an argument with another guest. I told him to leave and cool his temper." Hamish watched Malcolm's face closely. The man's eyes darted toward the far corner where a small group of hotel staff stood whispering. They quieted as soon as Blair glared in their direction. One young waitress stepped forward. "If I may, Officer Macbeth." Mr. McRae seemed frightened, not drunk. He kept asking if someone was still about. Blair scoffed. "They always look frightened when they're deep in the bottle." Hamish kept his tone calm. "Did he say who he was looking for?" She shook her head. "Only that he needed to speak to someone before morning." Malcolm shot her a warning look. The waitress shrank back, cheeks reddening. Blair, oblivious, strutted toward the exit. Outside, Hamish paused at the sight of the minister approaching. Reverend McPhee walked with his usual slow stride, his black coat flapping lightly in the wind. "I heard about Duncan," he said quietly. "He came to me last night, asking about forgiveness." "For what?" Hamish asked. "I dinna ken." The minister shook his head. "But he seemed burdened." He glanced toward Blair. "Though I doubt the inspector here believes in burdens of the heart." Blair snorted. "I believe in facts, and the fact is your man was drunk." Hamish thanked the minister and continued along the path back toward Patel's shop. Lugs walked with his nose low to the ground, occasionally stopping to sniff at footprints nearly washed away by the rain. Mrs. Patel was waiting, apron dusted with flour, arms folded. "Hamish," she whispered urgently. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but Duncan came by late last night. Bought a first-class stamp, just one, and an envelope." Hamish's brow lifted. "Did he post it?" Mrs. Patel shook her head. "No, he seemed too distracted, left without it." Hamish tucked the detail away. A single letter, meant for someone specific. Something Duncan thought was urgent enough to send before he died. When they returned to the jetty, the mist had finally thinned, giving way to a clearer stretch of loch. Blair stomped about, barking at Anderson to take photographs with the old station camera. Anderson fumbled each shot. Hamish crouched near the spot where Duncan had been found. Lugs sniffed again, letting out a small, uneasy huff. There was something in the air now, something sharper, more unsettling. Hamish rose slowly, brushing the damp from his knees. The mist drifted off the loch like a curtain being drawn aside. In that brief clarity, he felt the shift in the investigation. Duncan McRae hadn't come back to Loch Dubh for mischief or pride. He had come back carrying a secret, and someone here had wanted that secret buried with him. Hamish placed a steadying hand on Lugs's warm back. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "This isn't over." The drizzle had returned by the time Hamish left the station, drifting over the village in soft, slanted sheets that blurred the colours of the buildings and turned the loch into a dull stretch of pewter. Lugs walked ahead but kept glancing back, ears flicking in wary anticipation. The dog disliked the Loch Dubh Hotel almost as much as he disliked Blair, and Hamish suspected Lugs sensed that today's visit would be no simple social call. There was a faint tang of peat smoke in the air, someone's stove burning half-damp fuel, and beneath it the sharper scent of the wet earth rising from the roadside embankment. Hamish pulled his jacket tighter, feeling the cold settling into his sleeves. The hotel sat near the harbour, its once fine stonework now bearing the weary look of a building that had survived too many seasons and too many guests. The sign creaked as a gust of wind tugged at it. Warm light glowed faintly through the front windows, though even that seemed cautious, as if uncertain who might step through the door. Inside, the lobby smelled of damp coats and weak furniture polish. Malcolm Fraser, the manager, was behind the counter, and the moment he spotted Hamish, his face rearranged itself into a stiff smile that didn't reach his eyes. Malcolm was a heavy-set man with a thinning patch atop his head and a tendency to perspire when nervous. Today, the sheen on his forehead suggested great unease. "Sergeant Macbeth," Malcolm said, though he never quite managed to disguise the slight tremor in his voice. "Terrible business. What happened to Duncan?" Hamish nodded. "Aye, it is." He kept his tone mild, almost apologetic, the better to be underestimated. "Thought I'd just ask a few questions." Malcolm swallowed. "Of course. Anything to help." Luggs sniffed the air, then approached Malcolm with deliberate steps. The dog paused at Malcolm's coat, nose brushing against a dark patch near the hem. Malcolm stepped back sharply. "Mind your mutt," he snapped. Hamish's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "He won't harm you. He's just curious." Malcolm tugged at his coat self-consciously. The patch was faintly crusted with peat, the kind found along the moor path rather than the village streets. Hamish tucked the observation away. A young waitress edged forward from the dining room, her fingers twisting the corner of her apron. "Fiona," he recalled. "Quiet girl, quick to blush." She glanced at Malcolm, then at Hamish. Sergeant, maybe I should tell you," Malcolm glared. "Back to your work." But Fiona stood her ground, though her voice trembled. "Mr. McRae came here last night. He looked worn out, and he begged Mr. Fraser for one last chance at playing here again." Her cheeks reddened. "Mr. Fraser told him he'd rather toss him in the loch." Hamish looked at Malcolm. Malcolm turned crimson. "It was an expression," he said hastily. "The man was drunk, slurring, ranting, upsetting the guests." Fiona shook her head. "He wasn't drunk, he was frightened." Malcolm dismissed her with a sweep of his hand. "She's young, soft-hearted. She misread the situation." Hamish simply watched him. Malcolm fidgeted beneath the scrutiny, then gestured toward his office. "We can speak privately, Sergeant." Hamish followed him, with Luggs trotting closely behind. The office was cramped and humid, littered with disorganized paperwork. A heater in the corner clattered intermittently. Malcolm moved a stack of invoices off a chair, muttering apologies as he did. On the desk, half buried beneath receipts, lay an envelope addressed to a law firm in Inverness. Hamish's observant eye caught the first line of a letter beneath it, written in Malcolm's careful, tense handwriting. Regarding the property boundary dispute, Malcolm saw his gaze and swiftly placed a ledger over the paper. "Hotel business," he said too quickly. "Of course," Hamish murmured. "So Duncan was here last night?" "Aye," Malcolm said. "Came in all flustered. Tried to charm, then threaten, then beg. Same as always. I told him we were full." Hamish tilted his head. "You had vacancies." Malcolm coloured again. "Well, yes, but we didn't want trouble." "Did he argue with any guests?" "One, a man from Glasgow, complained that Duncan was glaring at him." Malcolm rubbed his forehead. "Look, Sergeant, Duncan brought trouble, always did. But I swear he left here alive." Hamish nodded, letting his gaze drift once more around the room. Stacks of unpaid invoices, a cracked lamp, a window that rattled with every gust. Malcolm's life was held together with the thin thread of a failing business, and Hamish felt a familiar pang of sympathy. Hard circumstances made people short-tempered, but they didn't make them killers. Not necessarily. Still, a man with money worries and a bruised pride might lash out if he felt cornered. "Did Duncan say why he'd come back?" Hamish asked. Malcolm hesitated. "He said he had something to make right, but I didn't want to hear it. I've had enough on my plate without another of his tales." Outside the office, a kettle shrieked as someone overfilled it. Cupboards slammed, followed by a shouted exchange in the kitchen. Malcolm winced. "Staff troubles," he muttered. Hamish rose slowly. Malcolm looked relieved, which Hamish noted with mild amusement. On their way back through the lobby, Fiona met Hamish's eyes with an apologetic look. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered. "You didn't," Hamish assured her gently. Malcolm shot him a baleful glance. "I told you everything I know." Hamish nodded. "Aye, thank you." He stepped outside with Luggs into the cool drizzle. The street glistened, puddles reflecting the wavering hotel lights. Luggs shook himself with a violent shudder, spraying droplets across Hamish's trouser leg. Hamish barely noticed. His gaze drifted toward the moors beyond the village, where a faint ribbon of mist curled upward from the heather. "Come on, boy," he said softly. Luggs hesitated, staring toward the moor path, head tilted. The dog sensed something. Hamish could feel the ripple of tension in the stiff set of his shoulders. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "I feel it too." They walked on, the soft hiss of rain blending with the distant creak of boats at their moorings. The drizzle thickened, turning the air into a shimmering veil. Hamish lifted his collar against the chill and felt the familiar tug of melancholy that often accompanied his cases. Duncan McCrae's death had the quiet weight of unfinished business, and the hotelier's bluster had only deepened Hamish's unease. Malcolm Fraser had motive, pride, resentment, fear, but something about his panic felt too scattered, too sloppy. Hamish could picture Malcolm shouting threats, shoving papers, defending his shrinking livelihood. But murder? It didn't quite settle. Still, Duncan had visited someone else last night, someone who unsettled him enough to make him beg for a chance he knew he wouldn't get. The rain softened again, falling lightly on Hamish's hair. Luggs stayed close, occasionally pressing his side against Hamish's leg in quiet reassurance. The village around them seemed to hold its breath. The mist shifted like a curtain drawn back by an unseen hand. Somewhere out there, beyond the hotel and its petty grudges, someone was hiding a deeper fear. Hamish paused at the corner, gazing toward the moor, where the path disappeared into a grey shroud. The land waited in its patient way, holding secrets until someone with enough quiet persistence coaxed them out. "We'll get to the bottom of it, lad," Hamish said, his voice barely above a whisper. Luggs gave a small grunt of agreement. Together they continued into the soft drizzle, the village closing behind them in a hush of damp stone and muted light. The wind sharpened as Hamish walked the narrow road leading out of Loch Dubh, the kind of wind that bit through wool and made the ears sting. Clouds hung low over the moors, shifting like slow grey beasts, and the scent of peat smoke drifted intermittently across the air as though uncertain whether to linger. Luggs trotted beside him, occasionally lifting his head to test the wind with wary interest. The dog's tail flicked uneasily. Hamish understood the feeling. The moor path had its own silence, different from the village's muttered gossip, an older quiet that made a man think of things he might prefer not to. The neighbouring village lay huddled between two ridges, the cluster of cottages crouched against the cold. Callum Boyd lived on the far edge, in a squat stone dwelling that looked as though it would rather collapse than withstand one more winter storm. Smoke trailed thinly from the chimney, wavering in the wind before being pulled apart. Hamish stepped up to the door and knocked. The sound echoed flatly inside. Luggs let out a wary rumble. After a pause, the door jerked open, revealing Callum Boyd scowling, as though Hamish were a tax collector come early. "What?" Callum barked. His voice was rough, the voice of a man who preferred speaking to himself. Hamish offered a polite smile. "Just wanting a word, Callum. Mind if I come in out of the wind?" Callum sniffed. "Wind's fine where it is, but suit yourself." He stepped back, grudgingly allowing Hamish and Luggs to enter. The cottage interior was dim, shadows clinging to the corners, where stacks of cases and tools sat neglected. Several sets of bagpipes leaned against the wall like sleeping soldiers. The air smelled faintly of old wood, damp wool, and a hint of varnish. A small coal fire hissed in the hearth, its warmth failing to reach the rest of the room. A kilt hung over a chair near the fire, muddy along one edge. Hamish glanced at it, then at Callum. The man caught the look and stiffened. "That's old mud," Callum snapped. "Don't start your insinuations." "I haven't said a word yet," Hamish replied mildly. Callum grunted, arms crossing over his chest, his thick brows lowered into a familiar scowl. "I know why you're here. It's about Duncan." Hamish eased onto a chair that felt as though it had survived a century of complaints. Luggs settled beside him, but the dog's ears stayed tilted back, reading the tension in the air. "Aye," Hamish said. "Word is he might have come by here yesterday." Callum snorted. "He came all right, came stomping up the path like he owned the place. Same as always. How long had it been since you last saw him? Too long, Callum muttered. I never liked the man. Show off. Thought being able to puff on a set of pipes made him a celebrity. He spat the last word like a disease. Hamish waited. People filled silence when given the chance, and Callum was no exception. He comes knocking, Callum continued, pacing a short path across the cramped room. Starts blethering about money. Says I owed him from years back. Some competition circuit nonsense. Claims he covered for me once. Callum's face darkened. Utter rubbish. And what did you say? What do you think I said? I told him to get lost before I threw him off the step. Luggs let out a low whine, not from fear, but discomfort. The air in the room had thickened with Callum's resentment, a bitterness steeped as deep as old peat. Hamish rubbed Luggs's ears gently. Did he take it well? Callum's laugh was sharp and humourless. He left cursing me, threatening that the Highlands would be talking soon enough. Said he had news. Something big. He waved a hand. Duncan always had something big. Usually turned out to be a half-pay gig at a wedding. But this time? Hamish asked. Callum hesitated, then shrugged. He seemed different. A bit jittery. I thought he'd been drinking, but his eyes, well, they were sharp. Clear. Too clear. Hamish noted that. Duncan had looked worn and troubled, but not drunk. Not the man of bluster he once was. A man making amends, or trying. Did you argue long? Hamish asked. 5 minutes, if that, Callum replied. Then he stomped off down the road, muttering about people being ungrateful. Hamish glanced again at the muddy kilt. Been out walking much yourself lately? Callum followed his eyes and scowled. That's from this morning, if you must know. Went up the ridge. Needed fresh air after hearing the news. His jaw clenched. I didn't kill him, Macbeth. Hamish nodded slowly. I didn't say you did. Callum's voice softened, just a fraction. I wouldn't wish death on him. Annoyance, aye. Embarrassment, maybe. But not that. Hamish studied him for a long moment. Callum was abrasive, prickly as gorse, but not a man given to violence. Not the kind that struck fear into Duncan's face. No. Callum's grudges were petty, simmering under a lid of pride. But murder required more than pettiness. Where were you last night? Hamish asked quietly. Here, Callum said. Practising for that festival in Ullapool. Ask Mrs. MacLeod down the road. She shouted out the window for me to stop after 8 o'clock. Said she'd had enough piping to last her to Christmas. Hamish's lips twitched. That sounds about right. From what Hamish knew of Mrs. MacLeod, the alibi would hold. Luggs wandered toward the window and sniffed, tail stiff. Hamish followed his gaze. Outside, the wind swept across the heather in restless waves. Callum, Hamish said softly, did Duncan say who he meant to speak to next? After you? Callum frowned. No, but he mentioned he was making things right. Said some folk wouldn't thank him for it. He hesitated. He seemed scared, Macbeth. Duncan MacRae, scared. Never thought I'd see that. Hamish rose, brushing a bit of lint from his jacket. Thanks for the tea, he said, though none had been offered. It helped soften Callum's bristling dignity. The man gave a grunt that could have meant anything from farewell to good riddance. Outside, the wind cut across the moors with renewed force, tugging at Hamish's coat and sending a ripple through Luggs's fur. The sky was a pale, strained grey, and the ridges looked harder, sharper, as though carved from the day's unease. Hamish paused a few yards from the cottage. From somewhere far off, perhaps carried on a chance shift of wind, came a faint echo of piping. Not distinct, not close, just a trembling thread of sound that made the hair on Hamish's arms lift. Luggs pressed against him with a soft whimper. Aye, Hamish murmured. I hear it too. The wind swallowed the sound as quickly as it had come. Callum Boyd wasn't the killer. Hamish felt that as surely as he felt the weight of mist settling against his sleeves. But Duncan had been frightened, and fear left traces, echoes in the people he visited, shadows in his words, ripples across the moors. Someone else had received Duncan's troubled knock, someone whose secret was worth more than an old rivalry or unpaid debt. Hamish tightened his grip on Luggs's lead. Come on, boy, this road's not finished with us yet. They moved on through the sweeping wind, the moor stretching ahead like a quiet, watchful witness. There was a restless thickness to the air that afternoon, a fog rolling in from the loch with the quiet confidence of something that believed the village belonged to it. It settled along the rooftops in soft folds, blurring the distance and making the world feel closer, more secretive. Hamish Macbeth walked along the narrow lane toward the Curry sisters' cottage, his long stride unhurried, though Luggs stayed pressed close to his leg, tail tucked in wary resignation. The dog remembered the sisters well and had never forgiven Jessie for chasing him off her garden with a broom. The small whitewashed cottage crouched under the fog, its garden gate creaking as Hamish pushed it open. A faint smell of stewed cabbage wafted out from the slightly ajar window. Hamish sighed. Luggs whined softly, as if asking whether this ordeal was truly necessary. Inside, the cottage was warm and overbright, lit by too many lamps for a daytime hour. Jessie and Nessie Curry sat at opposite ends of their worn floral sofa, each with knitting needles poised mid-air like weapons. The moment Hamish stepped in, both women sat stiffly upright. "Oh, Sergeant Macbeth," Jessie said, clutching her chest. "We've been expecting you." "You have?" Hamish said mildly, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. Nessie sniffed. "Whenever there is trouble, you always come poking about." She narrowed her eyes. "You're here about Duncan McCrae, aren't you?" Hamish inclined his head. "Aye. I just need to ask a few questions." Jessie let out a dramatic sigh. The man was a disgrace, a shameless flirt, tried to court us both at one point. "Alternate Tuesdays," Nessie added primly. "We didn't appreciate it." Jessie glared at her. "No one is asking for your embellishments." Hamish held up a calming hand. "I'm not here to trouble you. I only want to know if either of you saw Duncan recently." The sisters exchanged a look. Brief, but unmistakably guilty. Luggs, who had squeezed himself under Hamish's chair, let out a faint grunt, sensing their tension. "Well," Jessie said, smoothing her skirt with unnecessary vigour, "he did darken our doorstep last night." Nessie huffed. "Barely. We didn't let him pass the threshold." "What did he want?" Hamish asked. Jessie pursed her lips. "Forgiveness." Nessie nodded gravely. "Aye, he said he needed to make something right before it was too late." Their needles resumed a furious clicking, as though the memory itself offended them. "Did he say for what?" Hamish asked, voice gentle. Jessie sniffed. "He mumbled something about a Sailey from years ago." Nessie snapped. "Don't mention that Sailey, Jessie." Jessie bristled. "You brought it up first." "I did not." "You did." Their argument surged immediately into old grievances. Who had danced too long with whom? Who had forgotten which tartan belonged to what distant cousin? And whether Duncan had deliberately stepped on Jessie's toe or simply suffered from poor coordination. Hamish endured it with patience, born of long acquaintance. He let the storm run its course until the knitting needles slowed, and the indignation exhausted itself. "So," he said quietly, "you turned him away." The sisters slumped, guilt softening their spines. "We didn't want gossip," Jessie said. "You know how people talk." "He was trembling," Nessie whispered unexpectedly. "Like a leaf, and not from drink." Jessie glanced at her sister. "Aye, he looked frightened." Hamish leaned back slightly, letting their tones settle in the room. Duncan had appeared anxious to Malcolm, agitated to Callum, frightened to the sisters, a pattern forming. "What time was this?" Hamish asked. "Just after 9, Jessie answered. "We were closing the curtains." "And you are certain he left alone?" Jessie nodded. "Yes, he walked toward the moor path, muttering." "Muttering what?" Hamish pressed. Nessie hesitated. "Something about finding the courage." Luggs shifted uneasily under the chair, nudging Hamish's foot. He reached down to pat the dog's head. Jessie suddenly burst out. "But we didn't kill him, Hamish Macbeth. Don't you start thinking that." "I'm not thinking that at all," Hamish said calmly. "You always look as though you're thinking," Nessie said accusingly. "It's his job," Jessie retorted. "A thinking job." "Can't trust a man who thinks too much," Nessie muttered. Hamish rubbed the bridge of his nose. "All I'm trying to do is piece together Duncan's last hours." The sisters fell silent, their eyes darting away from his. After a long pause, Jessie spoke more softly. "He asked us to forgive him, for the Sailey, and the shortbread, and the loan." Hamish blinked. "Loan?" Nessie went pink. "Just a pound or 2. 5, Jessie corrected sharply. 2. 5. 2, Hamish gently intervened. Regardless of the amount, did he repay it? Nessie sniffed. No, Jessie glared. Because he forgot, he never meant harm. Well, Nessie said, folding her arms defensively, we didn't want trouble, so we told him to go. Hamish watched them a moment. Their defensiveness wasn't the sharp defensiveness of guilt. It was the prickly shame of two women who had turned away a troubled man and now felt the weight of regret. He rose slowly. Lugs scrambled out from under the chair, as though released from captivity. I'm grateful for your honesty, Hamish said. Jessie's eyes shone for a moment. You don't think poorly of us? No, Hamish said softly. Not at all. Nessie cleared her throat. Well, that's good. Hamish reached for his coat. If you remember anything else, anything small, let me know. The sisters nodded solemnly, their earlier bluster subdued. As Hamish stepped outside, the heavy fog closed around him again, swallowing the village edges in its grey shroud. Lugs pressed close, and Hamish could feel the dog's unease in the slight tremor of his body. They walked toward the loch, the air thick with moisture. The sound of dripping water echoed from gutters and eaves. A gull cried somewhere unseen, the sound muted by the fog. Hamish paused near the church hall, looking toward the moor path the sisters mentioned. It wound into the fog like a thin thread disappearing into wool. Duncan McCrae had spent his last hours seeking forgiveness from everyone he had wronged. Small wrongs, petty wrongs, old embarrassments. But behind that was something deeper. A man didn't go door to door apologising unless he sensed a reckoning. Hamish stood very still, listening. Even the village felt subdued. Its usual gossip softened into cautious murmurs, muffled by the fog. Lugs let out a low whine. Aye, Hamish murmured. Something frightened him, and whoever frightened him is still here. They began walking again, disappearing into the fog as though swallowed by it, the path ahead dim but persistent, leading them toward whatever truth waited in the quiet places of Loch Dubh. The fog had thickened again by late afternoon, sliding across the moors in long grey veils that dulled the light and blurred the line between land and sky. Hamish Macbeth walked the narrow path toward Ewan Grant's croft, with Lugs trotting at his heel, the dog's ears flicking nervously at every distant bleat or shifting shadow. There was something different in the air. The mist smelled stronger, almost metallic, as though the weather itself sensed tension. Hamish buttoned his old jacket to the throat. The wind crept beneath the fabric anyway, cold and searching. Ewan Grant lived far beyond the main cluster of crofts, tucked at the foot of a low rise where the land grew sparse and unfriendly. The cottage was a squat stone building, its roof sagging slightly under years of winter snow. A battered lantern hung beside the door, broken glass still clinging to the frame. Hamish eyed it as he approached. Something about the break was recent. The shards on the ground hadn't yet sunk into the soft mud. Lugs let out a low growl, not hostile, just uneasy. Aye, lad, Hamish murmured. I've the same feeling myself. He knocked. The sound echoed through the small building. After a long pause, the door opened a crack, and Ewan Grant peered out, eyes sharp in his weathered face. He was a wiry man in his late 50s, lines etched deeply around his mouth. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, as though he'd lost weight too quickly. Oh, Ewan said, surprise mingled with wariness. It's you. Aye, Hamish answered. Mind if I come in for a moment? Ewan hesitated, then opened the door wider. If you must. The interior of the croft smelled of peat smoke and damp wool. A kettle sat on the stove, shaking slightly, as steam forced its way from the spout. The fire burned low in the grate. On a small table lay tools, scraps of rope, and a stack of papers half tucked into a drawer. Hamish stepped inside. Lugs stayed close, nose twitching. The dog stiffened when he caught Ewan's scent, a mix of peat, cold sweat, and something sharper beneath. You've heard about Duncan McCrae, Hamish said softly. Ewan's jaw tightened. I've heard. Hamish waited, hands in his pockets. Silence tended to fill itself, if given room. Ewan shifted uneasily, wiping his palms on his trousers. You'll be wanting to know if I saw him, Ewan muttered. It crossed my mind. Ewan sank into a chair. I haven't seen Duncan in years. Hamish's gaze drifted to the drawer left slightly ajar. A loose slip of paper protruded, white against the darker wood. He could see the top edge of handwriting. Familiar handwriting. Duncan's. Before Hamish could speak, Ewan shoved the drawer closed with a sharp movement. "Old receipts," Ewan said too quickly. "Nothing to do with anything." Hamish said nothing. Lugs let out a soft huff, sensing Ewan's spike of anxiety. The kettle rattled violently. Ewan rose to take it off the stove. His hand shook. He poured tea into chipped mugs, spilling some across the table. Hamish accepted his cup with a polite nod, though he doubted he would drink it. Ewan sat again, staring at the steam, as if reading messages in it. "What was your history with Duncan?" Hamish asked gently. Ewan grunted. "His father leased land from me once, years back. Duncan took over after the old man died, made a mess of it, left fences down, let sheep wander, claimed I was too strict. We argued. And since then? Nothing," Ewan said shortly. "I've kept to myself." Hamish took a sip of the tea. Weak, metallic. "He didn't visit you last night?" Ewan's eyes flicked to the door. "No." Hamish's gaze lowered to Ewan's trousers. Mud clung to the fabric. Fresh mud. Darker and wetter than the soil outside the cottage. Hamish had walked through the same path. He knew it didn't cling like that unless one had been near the burn at the foot of the moor. "Been out walking?" Hamish asked mildly. Ewan stiffened. "Had to check traps." "In the dark?" "Needed doing." Hamish let the answer hang. Outside, the fog pressed itself against the window, making the world beyond look like a blank sheet, waiting for truth to be written on it. "Tell me something, Ewan," Hamish said gently. "Why does the dog not like your scent?" Ewan's throat worked. "Dogs dislike plenty of things." "Not lugs," Hamish said. "Not without reason." Ewan slammed his mug onto the table. "I've told you, I didn't see Duncan." The outburst echoed harshly against the stone walls. Lugs growled softly, hackles rising. Hamish remained unmoved. "I've never said you did," Hamish replied in the same quiet tone. Ewan's shoulders sagged. He rubbed his face with trembling hands. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Just go." Hamish studied him a long moment. The man wasn't angry. He was frightened. It clung to him like damp, seeping through every gesture. But fear could come from many things. Poverty, shame, guilt, or secrets best left in the dark. Hamish stood. "If you remember anything, you know where to find me." Ewan didn't answer. He stared at the floor, as though the truth might be buried under the flagstones. Hamish stepped outside into the fog. The air tasted of cold ash and distant rain. Lugs pressed close to his leg, still tense. Hamish walked slowly down the path, letting the atmosphere settle around him. After several paces, he felt it, the unmistakable prickle of being watched. He paused and turned. Through the fog, he saw the faintest outline of Ewan standing in the doorway, eyes fixed on Hamish's back. Ewan retreated inside when he realised he'd been spotted. Hamish resumed walking. Lugs gave a low chuff of unease. "Something's not right," Hamish murmured. A gust of wind rushed across the moor, carrying the distant bleat of sheep and the faint creaking of a loose gate. The fog swirled behind Hamish, as though reluctant to let him leave. Ahead, Loch Dubh waited, lights glowing dimly through the mist, the warm shapes of cottages nestled in their usual huddle. But Hamish felt a heaviness inside him, as though a piece of the moor had attached itself stubbornly to his thoughts. Duncan had visited many people in his final hours, apologising, settling things, preparing. But Duncan had also been afraid, deeply, instinctively afraid, and fear left a trail sharper than footprints. Ewan Grant had something to hide. Whether guilt, shame, or something more dangerous, Hamish wasn't sure. But secrets kept in lonely crofts had a habit of rotting, and rot had a smell Lugs always noticed first. Hamish touched the dog's head. "Come on, lad, we're not done yet." They disappeared into the fog, walking toward whatever truth waited in the damp silence of the highlands. The fog had settled thicker than ever by nightfall, a heavy grey quilt pressed over Loch Dubh until even the familiar shapes of cottages seemed soft-edged and uncertain. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly toward the police station, Lugs padding beside him, both dog and man feeling the weight of the long day. The village was quiet, unusually so, only the faint dripping of moisture from gutters and the far-off creak of a boat shifting in its moorings disturbed the stillness. Hamish paused at the station door, wiping mist from his brows, before stepping inside to the welcome dimness of the single lamp he had left burning. The phone rang almost at once, its shrill note cutting through the silence. Lugs flinched. Hamish crossed the room and lifted the receiver. Macbeth, Patel's voice, anxious and breathless, spilled out. "Hamish, you'll want to come to the shop now. It's about Duncan." Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "On my way." He hung up, pulled his jacket back on, and stepped into the chill once more. The fog clung to him like damp wool as he hurried along the lane. Patel's shop glowed faintly through the murk, its lights blurred halos in the mist. Patel was waiting just outside, wringing his hands against the cold. "I found something," Patel said, thrusting an envelope at him. "It was dropped, right by the post office counter. Mrs. Durnford swears it wasn't there this morning." Hamish turned the envelope in his hand. The paper was creased, slightly damp at the corners, as though carried in a pocket on a long walk. The handwriting on the front was familiar, in a clumsy, uneven way. H.M. Lochdu Police Station. Luggs sniffed at it, then sat back with a faint whine. Patel lowered his voice. "It's from Duncan," Hamish nodded. "Aye." He slipped the envelope inside his jacket and thanked Patel, then walked back to the station, with Luggs close behind. The fog muffled their steps, turning the world strangely intimate, as though Loch Dubh itself leaned in to listen. Inside, Hamish lit the peat fire, coaxing reluctant flames from the half-dry turf. Once the small hearth glowed with steady warmth, he sat in his old chair, Luggs curling at his feet. Only then did he take out the envelope and open it with careful fingers. One piece of paper, one sentence. "I need to speak before someone stops me." Hamish stared at the words for a long time. Duncan's handwriting wobbled along the line. The letters crowded. The ink smudged slightly, where his hand must have shaken. The message was short, but the weight behind it pressed uncomfortably on Hamish's chest. Duncan hadn't come back for drink, or mischief, or the pathetic attention he had always sought. He hadn't come to dredge up old grudges. He had come to confess something, and he had been afraid someone would silence him before he managed it. Hamish lifted the paper to his nose. A faint scent lingered on it. Peat smoke, the sharp tang of damp earth, and something else. Whiskey, but not the cheap kind Duncan usually stole sips of. This was fuller, older, with a deeper burn. He'd smelled it somewhere else that day. Malcolm's coat, and again on Ewan Grant. Two men with nothing in common except irritation at Duncan and the smell of the same whiskey. Hamish tucked that detail away. He let his gaze drift into the fire. The flames flickered, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Luggs watched the shifting light with slow blinks, sensing Hamish's unrest. Hamish leaned down to stroke the dog's head. "Duncan was trying to tell me something, lad," he murmured. "Too late now." The room felt smaller, as though the truth Duncan carried had slipped inside as well, and now lingered like another presence. Hamish rose and paced slowly across the wooden floor, the old boards creaking quietly under his steps. He pictured Duncan wandering through Loch Dubh the night before, going from door to door like a ghost rehearsing its last rites, seeking forgiveness, seeking courage, seeking him, and failing to reach him. Hamish stopped by the window. Outside, the fog clung thick to the panes, reflecting back the dim glow of the fire. Somewhere beyond that murk lay the jetty, where Duncan had been found. Hamish could almost see him there, waiting, tired, cold and frightened, holding the letter he never posted, waiting for the person he trusted enough to meet in the dark, someone he thought wouldn't harm him, Hamish whispered. Luggs shifted uneasily. Hamish sat again and read the line once more. "I need to speak before someone stops me." It wasn't the warning of a drunk, it wasn't melodrama, it was the plain fear of a man who finally understood how deep he had wandered into something old and dangerous. Hamish folded the paper, set it on the table, then poured a cup of tea from the chipped pot warming by the fire. The taste was dull, metallic from overbrewing, but he barely noticed. His thoughts returned to the broken lantern outside Ewan's croft, the mud on Ewan's trousers, Malcolm's too quick temper, Callum's bitterness, the sisters stifled guilt. Duncan had moved through a web of tension in those last hours, and every strand Hamish tugged revealed another knot. He drank the tea slowly. The peat fire hissed and cracked. Luggs rested his chin on Hamish's foot, warm and steady. "Duncan didn't go to the jetty alone," Hamish finally said. "Someone led him there." He thought of the tide marks, the way the body had been positioned carefully, almost respectfully. Not in violence, not in panic, but in fear. Someone who hadn't meant to kill Duncan, perhaps, but had done so in a moment of anger or desperation. Someone who then arranged his body like a sad apology. Hamish stood and crossed again to the window. The fog outside moved in slow, shifting eddies. A faint sound carried through it, a creak, a splash, or simply the more breathing. Difficult to tell. Luggs rose too, ears alert. Hamish let the silence settle around them. There was danger in this case, quiet danger, the kind that crept rather than pounced. But it was danger all the same. Someone in Loch had a secret worth killing for. Someone who had grown afraid of Duncan's sudden conscience. He placed his hand on Luggs's head. "Tomorrow, we start again. Someone here knows why Duncan came back, and I'll get it out of them." Luggs gave a soft grunt, agreeing. Hamish turned back to the table, folded the letter with deliberate care, and placed it beside the fire to dry fully. That single line would be his guide now. Outside, the fog pressed closer, as if listening. The morning broke with a thin metallic light, the kind that never quite settled into day. A raw wind swept in off the loch, slicing through the mist and carrying with it the smell of cold water and wet stone. Hamish Macbeth stood outside the police station, hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea, watching the clouds move low and grudgingly across the hills. Luggs pressed against his leg, ears flicking at the distant rumble of a car engine climbing the narrow road toward the village. Hamish didn't need to see it to know who it was. Only one vehicle in Scotland made that particular whining growl, loud, irritated, and badly maintained. The Strathbane police car lurched into sight, the tyres spitting wet gravel, and screeched to an unnecessary stop beside the station. Detective Chief Inspector Blair flung the door open with theatrical force and heaved himself out, his face already flushed an angry red. Anderson, pale and apologetic looking as ever, scrambled behind him, clutching a thin stack of papers like a shield. "There ye are, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, stomping toward him. "Standing around as usual, doing nothing while I solve your case for you." Hamish took a calm sip of tea. "Morning, sir." "It's a grand morning indeed," Blair snarled triumphantly, "because I've found your killer." Luggs growled under his breath. Hamish didn't blame him. Blair jabbed a finger into the stack of papers Anderson held. "Malcolm Fraser, hotelier, a lying snake. As I always suspected, we found forged invoices in his office. Dozens. He's been up to his neck in dodgy dealings for years, and Duncan McRae was about to expose him." "And how do you know that?" Hamish asked quietly. "Because," Blair announced, puffing out his chest, "Malcolm confessed he had an argument with Duncan last night. Said Duncan was going around asking questions about money, and I bet the piper threatened to blab about the forged invoices. So Malcolm killed him and made it look like an accident." Hamish kept his face carefully blank. "And how exactly did Malcolm kill him?" "Drowned him, ye idiot," Blair roared. "Pushed him off the jetty. Easy." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Did Malcolm say that?" "He doesn't need to," Blair snapped. "I've got motive, opportunity, and evidence. That's more than you've managed. Anderson." "Yes, sir." Anderson eagerly presented the papers. These are the invoices, Macbeth. All forged. Some are months old, some recent. Malcolm hid them behind a false panel in his desk." Blair folded his arms smugly. "We've already arrested him. He's in the car." Hamish felt a flicker of irritation, sharp but fleeting. "Malcolm's been arrested?" "Aye," Blair said, grinning. "And I'll be taking him straight back to Strathbane, where he can stew in a nice cell." Hamish set his mug down. "I'd like to speak with him before you take him away." Blair's grin vanished. "Ye will not. I'm in charge here." Hamish gave a quiet sigh, the kind Blair never recognised as resistance. "If I'm to sign off on the transfer, sir, I do need to confirm the condition of the prisoner." Blair glared suspiciously, but the bureaucracy of it appealed to him. "Fine, 2 minutes." but don't you try anything funny." Hamish walked to the police car. Malcolm sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, rainwater dripping from his ruined hair. The man looked pale, dishevelled, frightened, yet not like a killer. More like someone who'd been caught with his hand in a biscuit tin and didn't know how to explain himself. "Malcolm," Hamish said softly, opening the door. "I didn't kill him," Malcolm burst out immediately. "I swear to you, Hamish. I argued with Duncan, yes, but I didn't lay a finger on him. I just want this law dispute ended. I forged some invoices. I admit that. I panicked. But murder? Never." Hamish nodded. "Tell me where you were last night. The exact time." Malcolm took a shuddering breath. "I was at the hotel until 10. The night porter saw me. Then I went home. My wife says I came in dripping wet from the rain. I didn't go near the jetty." Hamish glanced toward the loch, its silvery surface broken only by the faint ripples of wind. The tide times tugged at his memory. He'd checked them earlier. Duncan's boots, his damp clothes, his position against the jetty posts. Something had felt wrong about Blair's conclusions. Something about the tide. "Thank you," Hamish said quietly. "Can I go?" Malcolm begged. "Not yet," Hamish murmured, "but I'll do what I can." He shut the door and walked back toward Blair, who stood glaring at the village as though offended by its existence. "Well?" Blair demanded. Hamish looked thoughtful. "Sir, I'd like to check something before you take Malcolm away." "No," Blair barked. "It won't take long," Hamish said mildly. "Just a quick word with the tourists who were walking near the jetty last night." Blair's eyes bulged. "Tourists? What tourists?" "A couple staying at the Kerrytown B&B, Hamish said. "They mentioned to me earlier that they were out for a late walk." Blair looked panicked for a brief second, then blustered. "Fine, but ye've 5 minutes." Hamish headed toward the loch. Lugs trotted beside him, tails stiff. The tourists, a tall Englishman with a camera and his wife in a bright scarf, were admiring a boat tied at the small dock. They turned as Hamish approached. "Sorry to bother you again," Hamish said gently, "but I need to confirm the time you were here last night." "Oh, around 10:30, the man replied. "The tide was low, quite low actually. We heard shouting further along the shore, but it didn't sound close." Hamish's pulse quickened. "Are you certain it was 10:30? "Quite sure," the wife said. "I remember, because I checked my watch. We didn't want to wake the other guests coming in too late." Hamish nodded, watching the water lapping softly against the posts. At 10:30, the tide had been out. But when Duncan was found, his boots had been wet up to the ankle. Someone had moved him when the tide came in again. Blair's theory collapsed like wet peat. He walked back toward the Strathbane car, every step as steady as if he were strolling for pleasure. Blair was pacing impatiently, Anderson looking miserable beside him. "Well?" Blair snapped. "It couldn't have been Malcolm," Hamish said quietly. "The tide pattern rules him out. Duncan's body was moved later, after Malcolm was home." Blair's face went purple. "You're lying." "No, sir," Hamish said with maddening calm. "You're arresting the wrong man." Anderson looked like he wanted to disappear. Blair spluttered, swore, and finally roared, "Fine, let him out. But this isn't over, Macbeth. I'll get ye for obstruction." "Of course, sir," Hamish said pleasantly. Blair yanked open the car door and shouted at Malcolm to get out. The hotelier stumbled free, sagging with relief. Villagers who had begun to gather at the edges of the square let out soft sighs, their loyalty to Hamish as firm as ever. Blair climbed back into the car, slammed the door, and screeched off in a cloud of indignation and exhaust. The square slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Malcolm was whisked away by his wife, still shaking. Anderson lingered awkwardly before hurrying after Blair. Hamish stood alone for a moment, listening to the loch wind stir the mist along the water. Lugs nudged his hand. "Aye, lad," Hamish murmured. "We're back where we started, and the real killer's still here." He looked toward the moors, dark, waiting, and heavy with secrets. Someone in Loch Dubh had lured Duncan to the jetty, someone who knew the tides better than Blair ever would, someone Duncan trusted, and Hamish would find them. The day faded slowly into a muted Highland dusk, the kind that made the world feel half-dreamt, softened at the edges by drifting mist. Hamish Macbeth walked along the narrow track behind the police station, Lugs padding beside him, the dog's nose low to the ground, as though scenting the very mood of the place. The cold air held the faint bitterness of peat smoke and damp heather, and the quiet seemed deeper than usual, as if Loch Dubh itself were waiting for something. Hamish's long stride was unhurried, yet his mind churned steadily, sorting each thread of the tangled day. He reached the little shed behind the station, where Duncan's few belongings were stored for now. Items reclaimed from his pockets, his coat, the ruined bagpipes that had been set aside to dry. A single lantern lit the shed, throwing soft light across the old wooden table. Lugs hesitated at the threshold, then settled near the doorway, guarding without fuss. Hamish opened Duncan's jacket again and sifted through the meagre contents: a cracked lighter, a bent tin of mints, 2 coins. The faint smell of whiskey clung to the fabric, warm and smoky, more familiar than Hamish wished. He set the items aside and unfolded the torn sheet of paper he'd found earlier, the rough edges showing where Duncan had ripped it in haste. It was a map, hand-drawn, old, but clear enough for someone who knew the land, boundaries of crofts, paths marked with shaky lines, and one patch circled in Duncan's crooked hand, Ewan Grant's land. Hamish studied it. A memory flickered at the edge of recognition. Gossip from years ago, half-spoken. Something about Ewan's father, something about whiskey that never seemed to come from any shop. He traced the circled patch with his finger. If Duncan had found something there, it would explain his fear. It would explain the scent Hamish had noticed on Duncan's letter and on Ewan himself. He folded the map carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "We've work yet." Lugs rose at once, shaking off dust. Together they headed toward the moor path, the fading light growing thin around them. A cold wind swept across the open land, stirring the mist into shifting streams. Hamish walked steadily, thinking in the quiet way he always did on the moors, his mind clearing with each step. Duncan had come back not to stir trouble, but to lay down a burden. He'd moved from house to house the night before, seeking forgiveness, like a man preparing for judgment. Whatever he'd discovered on Ewan's land all those years ago had weighed on him, gnawing at his conscience, and now the truth had caught up. By the time Hamish reached Ewan's croft, dusk had deepened into a darker grey. A lantern glowed faintly outside the door, its light jittering with the wind. The broken glass from before had been swept away, though fresh mud marked the stones near the threshold. Ewan stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, shoulders hunched, as though bracing against more than weather. "So," Ewan said, voice rough, "you've come again?" Hamish nodded. "Aye, we need to talk." Ewan's gaze dropped to the ground. "I knew you'd be back." His hands shook slightly as he stepped aside. "Come in, then." Hamish entered, Lugs lingering near the door before settling by the hearth. The croft looked even smaller in the dim light, shadows clinging to every corner. Ewan set the lantern on the table, then sank into a chair as though the weight of his own secrets had finally become too much. Hamish spoke gently. "Duncan wrote to me. He meant to tell me something. Something about you." Ewan flinched. He wasn't supposed to. Hamish drew out the torn map and set it on the table. "He found your still, didn't he? Years ago." The crofter's face crumpled like old paper. "A still that was my father's before me," he whispered. "A way to keep the land going when the prices turned sour. Not greed, survival." "And Duncan helped himself," Hamish said quietly. Ewan nodded, shame dragging down his voice. "He found it by chance, stumbled into the wrong hollow on a foggy night, and once he tasted the whiskey, he started coming round for more. Said he'd keep quiet if I kept him supplied." Hamish's expression didn't change, though a cold disappointment settled in his chest. "Blackmail, then?" "Not at first," Ewan said quickly. "He was just a fool, a nuisance. I gave him a bottle now and then to keep him away, but he knew, and that was enough, and he came back to confess it all." Ewan covered his face with trembling hands. "He said he'd changed, said he couldn't carry it any longer. He said he'd tell you everything, and that you were fair-minded. But if word got out," his voice broke, "I'd lose the croft, everything. It's all I have, Macbeth, all my family had." Hamish waited. Silence pressed thick around them. Ewan's breath shuddered. "He came to the jetty, asked me to meet him there, said it had to end proper. I told him not to speak another word, but he said he'd go to you at first light. What happened? Hamish asked, voice low. Ewan swallowed hard. We argued. He raised his hand, just talking, but I saw it as a threat. I panicked, gave him a shove, only meant to stop him. His eyes glistened. He stumbled back, struck his head on the post. The sound. He shut his eyes. He went still at once. Hamish's throat tightened. He said nothing. Ewan wiped his face with shaking fingers. I didn't know what to do. It was an accident, but no one would believe it. Not with my still, not with his threats. I dragged him up, propped him against the posts, tried to make it look like drink or misstep. I thought the tide might take him, but I misjudged the time. I wasn't thinking clear. Hamish stood quietly by the table, the lantern's light flickering across his face. Lugs watched from the doorway, tail still, sensing the raw misery in the room. Ewan took a ragged breath. I'm not a violent man, I didn't mean it. He was a fool, but he didn't deserve that. Hamish nodded slowly. Fear makes folk do desperate things. Ewan looked up, eyes red. What will ye do? Hamish's answer was quiet, steady. What must be done? Ewan sagged in his chair, defeat settling over him like damp wool. Aye, I knew it. Hamish stepped toward the door. Get your coat, I'll take you in. No cuffs, no fuss. Ewan stood, shaking but resigned. He reached for his coat, the lantern shadow stretching long across the floor. Outside, the fog pressed close again, swallowing sound, wrapping the croft in a muffled hush. The lantern flickered once, twice, then steadied. Hamish paused at the threshold, glancing back. Ewan followed slowly, shoulders bowed beneath the weight of his own remorse. Lugs moved ahead on the path, leading them toward Loch Dubh, toward confession, toward the end of a long-kept secret. And in the mist, the truth settled at last. The rain began before dawn, a slow, unhurried fall that tapped gently on the roofs of Loch Dubh, as if reminding the village of unfinished business. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window of the police station, watching drops trail down the glass in crooked paths. The sky outside was a heavy sheet of grey, the loch barely visible through the shifting mist. Lugs lay curled beside the stove, lifting his head now and then, as though checking that Hamish was still there. The station smelled faintly of damp wool and peat smoke, comforting in its own plain way. Hamish sipped from a cup of tea that had cooled too quickly. He wasn't thinking about tea. He was thinking about Ewan Grant's face the night before, drawn, hollowed by fear, but finally relieved to have spoken the truth. Confession had broken something in the crofter, yet eased something too. Hamish understood that contradictory weight. The Highlands were full of folk carrying secrets, like stones in their pockets. A sharp knock came at the station door. Rain hissed louder as Hamish opened it. Ewan stood there, coat already soaked, shoulders hunched. He clutched his battered hat in both hands. Lugs rose immediately, tail low but not unfriendly. Ewan gave the dog a small nod. I didn't sleep, Ewan said quietly. Hamish stepped aside. Coming out of the wet. Ewan did, pausing to wipe his boots on the mat. Water dripped from his coat onto the wooden floor. He looked smaller in the dim light, as though the night had taken something vital from him. Hamish gestured him toward the chair near the stove. Lugs settled next to him, sensing the heaviness of the morning. You're doing the right thing, Hamish said softly. Ewan gave a hollow laugh. Aye, if there is such a thing. Hamish sat behind the desk, not reaching for any paperwork yet. He would get to that. We'll head to Strathbane later, but first I'll take your statement here, in peace. Ewan nodded. I'd appreciate that. I don't fancy Blair roaring at me. Hamish hid a small smile. Few do. The rain tapped rhythmically against the window as Ewan spoke. The confession came quietly, each word pulled from a deep place. He described the argument on the jetty, Duncan's fall, the panic that followed. He didn't try to excuse himself. He didn't paint Duncan as the villain. He spoke as a Highlander speaks, when he has no more lies left in him. Plainly, and with the weary acceptance that life didn't always offer mercy, Hamish wrote each detail by hand, his script neat but understated. He asked questions gently, guiding the story where needed, allowing Ewan's space to breathe when his voice faltered. When it was done, Ewan sagged back in the chair, exhausted. Hamish set down his pen. We'll go when you're ready. Ewan looked at him, eyes raw. I never meant harm. You know that. Hamish nodded. I do. Luggs pressed his head against Ewan's knee, a small gesture that made the man's face twist with quiet gratitude. They left the station together, Hamish locking the door behind him. The rain had grown steadier, a soft curtain falling across the square. No villagers lingered outside, even gossip bowed to weather like this. Ewan walked with a stiff, trudging step, as though each stride pulled him deeper into something he couldn't escape. Luggs walked between them, glancing from one man to the other. At the waiting police car, Hamish paused. No handcuffs, no fuss. You'll sit in the front with me. Ewan swallowed thickly and nodded. Thank ye. Hamish helped him settle into the passenger seat. The engine started reluctantly, coughing once before warming. Raindrops raced across the windscreen in frantic lines. Luggs sat in the back, watching quietly. They drove slowly along the winding road out of Loch Dubh, tyres hissing through standing water. The moors stretched in grey, rain-soaked waves. From time to time, Ewan shifted, as though expecting Hamish to lecture him. But Hamish said nothing. Silence was kinder than judgment. About halfway to Strathbane, Hamish spoke. I'll write the report, straight facts, nothing more. Ewan stared out the window. Even straight facts can ruin a man. Sometimes, Hamish said gently, ruin is what sets things right. The crofter turned that over quietly in his mind. They reached Strathbane's grim concrete police headquarters just as Blair barreled out of the front entrance, waving his arms like a man hailing a ship. His face twisted into a self-satisfied grin the moment he saw Hamish step from the car. Macbeth! Blair shouted, striding through the rain as though it dared not touch him. I hear you've finally got something useful to report. Hamish kept his expression calm. Aye, sir. Ewan Grant has come in voluntarily. Blair's eyes gleamed with triumph. Voluntarily, did he? And I suppose you'll be saying you coaxed it out of him with your soft voice and your sweet tea. Hamish didn't bother answering. Blair peered into the car at Ewan, puffing his chest importantly. Well, we'll take it from here. Anderson! Anderson hurried out, slipping slightly on the wet step. Yes, sir. Get this man booked. I'll be giving the press a statement. Hamish tensed. With respect, sir, a statement might stir up gossip back in Loch Dubh. Best keep it quiet until the Procurator Fiscal reviews the case. Blair blinked, caught between outrage and confusion. Before he could choose which, the phone inside the station rang shrilly. A young officer poked his head out. DCI Blair, Superintendent Davitt is on the line. Says it's urgent. Blair stiffened like a scolded schoolboy. Blast! He shot Hamish a glare. This isn't finished, Macbeth. He stomped inside. Anderson gave Hamish a helpless look before guiding Ewan in with surprising gentleness. Hamish stood for a moment in the rain, letting it soak into his jacket. Strathbane always felt colder, bleaker. Even the puddles seemed mean-spirited. Luggs whined softly from the back seat, impatient to return home. Hamish drove slowly back toward Loch Dubh, the rain easing into a steady drizzle. When they reached the village, a few faces peered from windows. Curious, worried, loyal. Gossip might travel fast, but Loch Dubh also knew how to close ranks around its own. They would mourn Duncan in their prickly, uneven ways. They would pity Ewan in private, and they would trust Hamish to handle the rest without fuss. At the station, the phone rang again. Hamish answered on the second ring. Macbeth. Davitt's voice came through, tight and self-important. I've seen your preliminary report. Neatly done. Minimal trouble, minimal scandal. Exactly what we like to see. Hamish stared at the wall. Aye, sir. Keep it that way. The press doesn't need details. Davitt cleared his throat. Carry on. The line went dead. Hamish hung up and set the receiver down carefully. The fire had died low. He stirred it back to life with practiced movements. Luggs settled beside him, head on paws. Rain whispered along the roof. The day felt thin, hollowed out. Duncan dead. Ewan broken. A secret dragged into light only because fear had tipped into desperation. Hamish sat quietly, hands around his mug, staring into the flame. Folk do daft things when they're afraid, he murmured. Luggs lifted his head briefly before resting it again. Outside, Loch Dubh exhaled beneath the rain, soft, subdued, waiting for morning. The first week after Ewan Grant's quiet arrest passed with the soft, tentative rhythm Loch Dubh always adopted after trouble. Rain washed through the streets, rinsing away the sharper edges of gossip, though not the whisper of it. The hills crouched under low clouds, their colours muted to greys and greens that felt older than memory. Hamish Macbeth walked the loch path most mornings, lugs trotting ahead, tail lifting only when the wind shifted or a gull cried overhead. The air held the faint smell of wet pine and distant wood smoke. Hamish found the quiet soothing. Solitude fit him like an old jumper, scratchy in places, but familiar. He carried no satisfaction in having solved Duncan MacRae's death. There was nothing triumphant in it. A foolish man had blundered into fear and paid the price. Another, burdened and desperate, had made one terrible mistake. Hamish had merely untangled the knots. Villagers greeted him with subtle gratitude. Patel pressed a warm scone into his hand one morning, saying nothing about murder, only remarking on the weather. Jessie and Nessie Curry whispered loudly to each other whenever he passed, praising his gentle authority, though Jessie ruined the compliment by adding she'd always suspected Duncan's demise had a domestic root. The Fishers nodded gruffly, and even the hotel staff looked at him with a newfound respect mixed with relief. But Hamish did not feel heroic. Loch Dubh had steadied itself, yet he sensed the village still drawing breath, waiting for its heartbeat to match the rhythm it had before Duncan's return. One evening, when the sky held the last smudge of pink behind gathering clouds, Hamish returned to his cottage with lugs at his heel. The scent of peat hung in the air like a remembered comfort. He lit the fire, coaxing orange glow from dark turf, and sat in his old armchair. The room warmed slowly, shadows trembling across the low ceiling. Lugs curled at his feet, letting out a contented sigh. Hamish took a long breath, staring into the flames. Duncan's foolish, wavering smile drifted through his mind. He remembered the man as he had been years before, loud, boastful, always trying too hard to appear grander than he was. A man who longed to be admired, but never managed to earn admiration honestly. Yet Duncan had returned to Loch Dubh seeking something like peace, even if he'd gone about it with the same clumsy desperation as everything else. Hamish leaned back. "Folk make trouble for themselves," he murmured softly, "then try to mend it too late." Lugs nudged his ankle, sensing the heaviness in his voice. Hamish reached down to pat the dog's head. The fire popped once, sending a bright ember drifting upward before dying to ash. Outside, the wind shifted. A faint strain of music drifted through the window. Hamish sat still, listening. Bagpipes, thin, distant, carried by the breeze from the neighbouring village. Not Duncan's tune, not exactly, but the melody wandered close enough to stir the ghost of it. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. Memory brushed against him. Duncan, at the old Saylead, cheeks ruddy, posture proud, playing a reel too loudly, yet somehow making the room brighten anyway. That same tune had played the night of Hamish's first arrest as a young constable. His nerves raw, his hands shaking as he led a drunken brawler to the station. Duncan had played as though the world depended on keeping the lad cheerful. The music faded slowly into the dusk. When it vanished entirely, Hamish felt the room fall deeper into silence. He rose to put on the kettle. The familiar clatter of the teapot lid reminded him that the world carried on, indifferent to human folly. Water simmered, steam curling like soft ghosts toward the ceiling. Lugs followed him into the kitchen, tail brushing against the cupboard. Just as Hamish poured the tea, a soft knock sounded at the door. He frowned. Visitors at this hour were rare. He set the teapot down and opened the door. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stood on the threshold, the evening wind teasing a strand of her fair hair, loose from its tidy arrangement. She wore a simple coat, elegant as always, though rain clung delicately to the fabric. "Priscilla," Hamish said, startled despite himself. "You're out late," she offered a small, composed smile. "I was passing by. I saw your light." Hamish stepped aside. "Come in, then." She entered with quiet steps, her gaze drifting briefly to Lugs, who greeted her with a polite wag of the tail. Priscilla knelt to scratch his ear, murmuring a soft hello before rising again. Hamish watched her, noticing, as he always did, the calmness she carried, the unspoken distance that never quite closed. "You look tired," she said gently. Hamish shrugged. "It's been a long week." She removed her gloves slowly, folding them neatly. "I heard about Ewan. People have been talking, though no one seems keen to say the details aloud." "That's best," Hamish replied. "No point stirring it up more than needed." Priscilla studied him a moment. "You handled it well." Hamish felt heat climb his neck, though the compliment was light. "I just did what needed doing." "Yes," she said, softly. "That's what you always do." The fire cracked behind them. Lugs settled near Priscilla's feet, comforted by her presence. Hamish poured tea for them both, and they sat at the small table. The quiet stretched companionably, broken only by the soft clink of cups. After a while, Priscilla folded her hands. "It must weigh on you sometimes, cases like this." Hamish stared into his tea. "Aye, folk get tangled in their own fears, and I always come along to pick through the knots. You don't give yourself enough credit." "Maybe." Hamish took a sip. "But sometimes I think Lochtub keeps me because I'm the only one daft enough to stay." Priscilla smiled faintly. "You belong here, Hamish, more than anyone." He didn't answer. The words settled somewhere deep, both comforting and painful. He glanced at her, seeing the quiet restraint in her eyes, the distance between their worlds that neither dared bridge. It was always like this, warmth that never quite grew into fire, affection wrapped in unspoken limits. Priscilla finished her tea and stood. "I should go. My father will wonder where I've disappeared to." Hamish rose too, reluctant to see her leave, but knowing he must. "Thank you for dropping by." She reached out briefly, touching his hand. "Take care of yourself, Hamish." He nodded. "You too." She stepped outside into the soft rain. Hamish watched her walk down the path, her figure fading into the mist until she became part of it. Only when she vanished entirely did he close the door. Back inside, the cottage felt warmer for her visit, but somehow lonelier too. Lugs nudged his leg as though reminding him he wasn't alone after all. Hamish returned to his chair by the fire, listening to the quiet hum of rain on the roof. He thought of Duncan again, not with bitterness, but with a kind of weary acceptance. A man flawed, foolish, yet reaching for redemption in the last hours of his life. Some ghosts linger, Hamish thought. Some leave, and some return only to remind him of the thin line between solitude and loneliness. He reached down to scratch Lugs behind the ears. "We'll manage, lad," he murmured. "We always do." Outside, the faintest echo of distant pipes drifted across the hills again, barely audible, but unmistakably real. Hamish listened for a moment, eyes softening. Then he rose to put on the kettle once more.